As I have stated in my recent livestream, one of the main focuses of this channel is the recreating and storytelling of ships that are not as well known or are almost completely forgotten to history. Oftentimes these vessels have had very interesting lives and tend to add more to the rich history of the ocean liner, especially when discussing the development of well-known express liners. For me, SS Duilio of the Italian merchant company abbreviated as NGI is definitely one of those ships that deserves some attention, not only due to her somewhat chaotic history, but for being Italy's first superliner and essentially being the grandmother of one of the most well-known ocean liners in history, the SS Rex. The life of SS Duilio began in the year 1910 with an individual named Fabio Garelli. Garelli was a naval architect who had graduated with honors from the University of Genoa in 1889. He came to the attention of NGI when he presented a detailed concept of an ocean liner specifically for the South American market. He was eventually appointed as NGI's technical director and became a well-known and respected character. Another thing that should be added to better understand why Duilio was brought into being in the first place is talking about a series of events that happened starting in 1906. Since the 1840s, when ocean travel started to become a safer and profitable market, especially in the immigrant trade, every country and company vied for the prestige of having the largest, fastest, and most luxurious liners to cross the oceans of the world. Italian companies, however, simply did not have the resources or infrastructure to support this new market. The majority of the Italian transatlantic trade had been sent over to companies of other European powers. But in 1906, things began to change for the better for NGI and other Italian merchant companies. Dubbed the Mediterranean Conference, the goal was to essentially expand Italy's merchant fleet and limit foreign companies and countries from having the majority share in their market. The outcome was, most noticeably, the limiting of port departures for the French, British, and German ships to just 150 per year, whilst increasing the departure numbers for Italian companies. While it was not much, several more conferences were held in later years to further help growth. By 1911, Italian-based companies had about a 62% reach on the migrant trade to and from the country. As a result of this, NGI had to very quickly grow their fleet. After one of these conferences, 3 British liners were purchased. Following some refurbishment and renaming, they were put into service. They also put out 6 8,000-ton well-designed liners. 3 of these, named the Duca degli Abruzzi, Duca di Giovanna, and the Duca di Rosta, were placed on the New York run. For a time, NGI had the largest merchant fleet in Italy. The company was really beginning to grow. But if they wanted to make a big impression on the now exploding express liner transatlantic stage, they needed to do something bigger and bolder than any Italian company had put out, especially since one of their main rivals, Lloyd Sabato, was working on a pair of large liners as well. And so in 1910, the first drawings and concepts began to be put forward by Garelli. The original intent by NGI was to have this project consisting of 2 15,000-ton liners, destined for the Latin American market, and one 20,000-ton liner for their express New York run. This project was approved by mid-1912. But during this time, a great tragedy had hit the transatlantic market when the new Queen of the Ocean, RMS Titanic, sank on her maiden voyage with a loss of 1,496. As many companies did following the tragedy, NGI especially wanted to make sure that their new project would be focused on passenger safety and efficient evacuation protocols. By 1913, the final general arrangement plans were presented to NGI's board of directors. They called for 2 sister ships, each weighing just over 20,000 tons, which would make them the largest Italian ocean liners yet. They would also be the longest, both being just more and 630 feet in length. And they would also be the fastest Italian liners, each capable of a speed greater than 20 knots. Their interiors would be the ultimate expression of classic Italian decor. She featured several multi-level, breathtaking public spaces that also offered large amounts of natural light to pass through, not a common thing to find on an ocean liner at that time. But before the final designs could be sent over to the shipyards who would build these liners, Garelli left NGI. As a result, another well-known architect was brought in, Nabor Soliani. He made several alterations to the design, most notably the changing of the stern from a clipper design to a cruiser one. This increased strength and allowed for the addition of more passenger cabins and public spaces. Finally, by December 1913, the contract to build the first vessel was awarded to the Ansaldo of Genoa shipyard. The other liner would be built by Swan, Hunter, and Wickham Richardson shipyard in England. That vessel would later be named SS Duilio Cesare, and even though these two ships were sisters, they would feature a noticeably different hull form and superstructure. On December 30th, 1913, the contract was signed in the shipyard with an expected completion date of Q2 1915. On the 30th of May of 1914, the keel was laid for Italy's first quadruple screw liner. Construction, however, would slow considerably by late 1914 as a result of the start of the Great War that was consuming most of continental Europe. By January of 1916, about 6 months past the expected completion date, the hull was ready for launching. A private ceremony was held on the 9th, and the ship was named Duilio, and the hull was launched. After that, all construction was halted. Even when the war ended in November of 1918, the finishing of Duilio did not really pick up for another few years. But by the early 1920s, fitting out had finally commenced. By mid-October of 1923, almost 10 years after the keel was first laid, the new SS Duilio was completed and handed over to NGI. On the 22nd, she was registered in Genoa, and the next day, she departed Genoa for New York via Naples on her long-awaited maiden voyage. She was very much a success in her first few years. Among her many innovations and focus on safety was a number of watertight compartments she had. At the time, regulations called for ships of her size to have only 12. She had 17. That would enable her to stay afloat with even 4 completely flooded. She was also one of the first Italian liners to be fitted with anti-roll cases. But due to circumstances out of her control, her being the face of NGI, being the most innovative and luxurious liner for the company, was about to end. Competition within Italy involving several other companies had increased substantially following the First World War, and it didn't help that Duilio was so delayed. NGI, however, was doing well, though they needed to go even bigger. By 1926, they introduced the SS Roma, which took a lot of design cues from Duilio and improved them further. The next year, the MS Augustus entered the arena. At 33,000 tons, she was the largest Italian liner, the largest motor vessel, and the first transatlantic ocean liner to have a permanent open-air lido deck and pool. While somewhat revolutionary, she was very evolutionary, with many design aspects being taken from Duilio. As a result of being surpassed by new running mates, Duilio sailed on her last express run voyage to New York in July of 1928. She was then transferred over to the Latin American routes with her sister. By the late 1920s, NGI was booming, so much so that another pair of sisters were being designed, both over 40,000 tons. Rex and Dux were to be their names. But before Duilio can be joined by those two, the Wall Street crash of 1929 changed everything for the company. By the early 30s, Mussolini forced the merging of NGI with two of their greatest rivals to create the state-owned and controlled Italian line, as a result of near economic collapse of the country's merchant fleet. Rex would eventually be built, but Dux was cancelled due to the lack of government support and funds. Duilio was eventually repainted to support her role in the new company. In March 1934, following an extensive refit, Duilio began services to the newly reopened South African routes after the South African government awarded the mail contract to the Italian line. It had previously been held by the Union Castle line. In 1936, Duilio was transferred over to Lloyd Terrestino and maintained the same service. By May of 1939, with world events beginning to turn the current climate sour, Duilio returned to Genoa and was laid up. But in June, she was employed for one voyage as reparations for a number of Italian veterans of the Spain Civil War. Following that voyage, she was laid up again. When World War II commenced just a few months later, Duilio continued to sit, waiting for whatever fate came to her. Duilio finally saw some service again in March of 1942 when she was chartered by the International Red Cross for 3 voyages. Following that, she was laid up once more in the port of Trieste in August 1943. She was joined by her sister, Giulio Cesare. Many who are familiar with Lloyd Terrestino will be aware of how many ships in their fleet were lost during the Second World War. According to records kept by the company, they had 85 ships going to the war. By the end, they only had 5. Unfortunately, Duilio was not in that group. On the 10th of July, 1944, Allied aircraft attacked the port of Trieste. This attack included the destruction of Duilio. Following the raid, she partially sank in the shallow harbor. Another liner next to her, the MS Sabadia, was also sunk. Her sister remained untouched, but was later destroyed in another air raid. Duilio's troubled life finally came to a close starting in February of 1948, when her wreck was refloated and towed to the nearby San Rocco shipyard, where her final demolition then commenced. Soon she was nothing more than a pile of rusting steel. The lives of most Italian liners do not have happy endings, usually being victims of war. Duilio was born into a time of great demand and new growth. Delayed by almost 8 years, she still proved to be a success. But because of that delay, she did not have the time to really shine. However, that design and legacy passed down to Roma and Augustus, and eventually it all culminated into Rex, whom is possibly the most famous Italian ocean liner in history behind the Andrea Doria. Duilio herself was quite a liner, inside and out, but because of being put into a specific time period and being where she was in that time period, she, like many other Italian liners, never got to truly flourish on the world stage.